I wanted to read a scripture passage from the book of Ephesians, chapter 5, verse 25 through to the end of the chapter, verse 33. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. He gave himself up for her to make her holy, purifying her in the bath of water by the power of the word, to present himself a glorious church, holy and immaculate, without stain or wrinkle or anything of that sort. Husbands should love their wives as they do their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. Observe that no one ever hates his own flesh. No, he nourishes it and takes care of it, as Christ cares for the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall cling to his wife, and the two shall be made into one. This is a great mystery. I mean it in regards to Christ and the church. In any case, each one should love his wife as he loves himself, the wife, for her part, showing respect for her husband. We hear in this passage two very difficult passages, that when the book of Genesis is talking about marriage, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, that this is a reference to Christ and his church. Likewise, we hear, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. He gave himself up for her. How did Christ love the church? Christ loved the church from the cross. Christ laid down his life for his bride, the church. You may be familiar, after Jesus died, his side is pierced, and water and blood pour out. Water, like the water of baptism mentioned in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 26, purifying her in the bath of water by the power of the word. And blood, like the Eucharist. And if we rewind all the way back to Genesis, we see that Adam is put into a deep sleep. This deep sleep is like the death of Christ. And from his side, what is taken out? A rib. And from this rib, from his own death and giving up of his own body, God makes Eve. Just as from the side of Christ, God makes the church. Now, why am I saying all of this? I think it is very important for us, especially for those who are married, to realize why we need to understand the cross. To realize how the cross applies to our lives. The cross applies to our lives because it is our model for marriage. The cross applies to our lives because it is our model for relationships. The cross applies to our lives because it is our model for daily life. In fact, according to Paul in the book of Ephesians, the reason that people get married is so that in a good marriage, they can see a symbol of Christ dying on the cross. The two shall be made into one. The two shall become one flesh. What does this mean? That each of them die. That each of them die. And it is through this death that they are able to have new life. It is through this death that they are able to have life-giving love. It is through this death to self that they are able to have children, to have a family, to become this single unit. Now, it gets even more interesting because we see the night before the crucifixion, we have the Last Supper. And at the Last Supper, we have the washing of feet, an act of service that the leader leads through service. And we have Jesus saying, "Take, eat, this is my body given up for you. This is my body given up for you." That in marriage, it is a self-giving. It is for each one primarily a giving of themselves rather than a taking. Now, there is something in the modern world which is in many ways the opposite of the cross. The cross is an image, and there is violence in it. It is an image, and there is violence in it. But through this kind of violence, we have salvation. Through Jesus offering of himself, we have salvation. And we see Jesus saying, "Take, eat, this is my body given up for you." There are a group of images very prevalent on the internet, very prevalent in so-called adult bookstores, very prevalent, used to be in magazines and VHS tapes, that rather than saying that relationships are about giving, it says that relationships are about taking. And that rather than someone saying, "This is my body given for you," we hear the people say, "Let me take. Let me take. Let me take." It becomes rather than an act of love, a self-sacrifice. Rather than a death, it becomes a pursuing of life that ends in death, in spiritual death, that kills one's ability to have relationships because we begin to see people not as others, not as people made in the image of God, but rather as objects. Objects to be used, objects to be taken advantage of, objects for us. That the other is for us. And if we look at the Greek word, that represents so many of these words, pornea, this means violent imagery. Violent imagery. Images that themselves do violence to the one who looks at them. That these images are the opposite of the cross. That these images are the opposite of the cross because they require no death of self, they require no self-giving, they require no two becoming one flesh, but use, objectification, people not as image of God, but as objects. Now, for many people, this kind of imagery is a great struggle. From children 10 years old to men and women in their 80s and 90s. And yet, many do not know how much harm it is doing to themselves, how much harm it is doing to their relationships. And now, in these troubling times, when we do not have a lot to distract ourselves with, when we are left alone with our thoughts, we have a choice. Do I turn to images that will destroy my relationships? Do I turn to images that will destroy my knowledge of self, my ability to see others as made in the image of God? Or do I turn to the image of Christ on the cross, who says, "This is my body given for you," who is what every marriage points to, who teaches us how to live by dying to this world and having resurrection to new life?